Welcome to another of my Q&A concerning your Eastern Roman questions. This time, we will go a bit more in-depth to specific time periods of the millennium-old empire, as you have some pretty good questions about almost every era. So it's going to be another long video. I regret to say, however, that Trebizondine questions will be not included as of yet, since I got a bunch of really detailed and quality questions from someone. So I will need to do extra research, and I plan to make a special video for Trebizond questions after I finish my Trebizond Samurai series. Sounds good? If you have Trebizond questions, you can already submit them in the meantime. Okay, on to the good stuff. What was the Eastern Roman view of the Trojan War, considering the Romans were descendants of Aeneas, a Trojan, but the medieval imperial populace was overwhelmingly, ethnically, culturally, and linguistically Greek? Fun question. First, what you need to know is that the Iliad and the Odyssey were fundamental education for young Greeks and Romans from antiquity all the way to 1453. And that was what parents stuffed into their hands at 5 years old, the first book they learned to read. Homer was at the base of a young Roman's literary learning, their first textbook. Thus, the Trojan War was something that followed their consciousness their whole lives. You see many allusions to this epic event, which shaped the Greek and Roman civilizations throughout the literature of this empire, which inherited from both Greece and Rome. But keep in mind that when you ask these questions, there wasn't some Byzantine hive mind with one universal opinion on something. Different Romans from different centuries had diverging thoughts. So the Trojan War is a topic itself, a quite popular subject that everyone knows. It's something you'd throw into your conversation as witty references and show off your familiarity with Homer at parties. There were those who still acknowledged themselves as descendants of Romans, of Aeneas and Troy, like the Antiochian chronicler Ioannes I, who dedicated almost 1/18 of his work on world history to the Trojan War, and went very much into detail, and sided primarily with Troy in his writing. But Malalas was a contemporary of Justinian the Great, restorer of Old Rome, at the height of the universal Roman identity period of the Eastern Roman Empire. So not everyone would feel like that, especially if the Greek element was taking over more in the state, because, as we know in the wider Greek consciousness, the Achaeans are the ones revered for their exploits. Brave Achilles, cunning Odysseus. Up until today, Achilles is still considered an archetype of the Hellenic hero, and people will model theirs on him, intentionally or not. So, follow up here. When the Byzantines then created their own epic culture, of course they modeled it on Homeric epics, and their heroes on Homeric heroes. But ironically, with the advent of characteristically Byzantine heroes like Digenis Akritas, our favorite medieval border warrior, the Byzantine writers started distancing themselves from Homer. If you saw my video reading books 3 and 4 of a version of the Aeneas, you will remember the passage where the narrator just plainly states how the Aeneas in his totally real story was so much cooler than Homer and his fables. And this was no isolated incident. The written epic of the Aeneas is theorized to be a product of the Komnenian Renaissance. In the 12th century, a period of explosion of intellectual activity and reappearance of a great interest in the Greek classics, with the Roman scholars engaging with them in very creative ways. They also revived the ancient literary genre of the novel, which is fascinating. I'll definitely gladly talk more to you guys about Komnenian period literature another time, but the point is that during this era, another historian, Constantinos Manasis, dedicated a historical work to his patroness, Irene Komneni, also a history of the world, which included the Trojan War as real history like the one by Malalas. And Manasis showed the same tendency of judging Homer to be a great storyteller, but distorting the real truth. So he recorded his version of the Trojan War instead. And this version was the one that the romances of the Palaiologan era were based on, being more neutral and less supportive of either side and more just trying to focus themes of love and war, like romances do. Maybe we strayed a little from the topic, because Homer and Byzantium is just such a fun topic. But to make it simple, everyone knew and was familiar with the Trojan War, referenced it a lot in their works, but there is no consensus on which side all Eastern Romans supported. And to be fair, neither did Homer designate a good guy side in his Iliad, and depicted Greeks rather ruthlessly even though the poet was himself Greek. Byzantines too had concerns about the moralities of Homeric heroes, but still admired them greatly and used them as prototypes for their own, like the Ioannes. And to create more inception, the Ioannes, a product of Anatolian Roman oral tradition and Homeric hero tropes, painted many scenes from mythology, including the Trojan War, on the walls of his castle on the Euphrates. So when even a fictional character talks about the fictionalized event we have in mind, you know that Homer was iconic and transcends pure national disputes. It's a classic that either Greeks or Romans could enjoy and interpret, or in our case, the Greco-Roman Byzantines. Which single civil war or conspiracy or usurpation, etc., since 476 was fought for the dumbest or most pointless reason? I think that any of the coups or rebellion attempts by Isakios Komnenos, son of Alexios I, are pointless as hell. He just couldn't accept the fact that his elder brother Ioannes II was already the most perfect successor to their father. He was jealous that even Ioannes' Turkish friend, Aksuk, enjoyed higher honors than him at court. You know, classic little brother drama. And he really made Ioannes II the good reign into a good reign instead of a great reign. Because imagine what Ioannes could have accomplished without the constant conspiracies from the one person discontent with his rule. Literally, only single one, unless you count the very skeptical story Choniatis wrote of an Komnenian Restoration coup attempt when Alexios died. That's how amazing of an emperor Ioannes was, and how pointless it was to go against him. Why do historians consider Justinian as an overrated ruler? Sad face. Because Justinian was rated highly by ancient authors. Even in Procopius is painted positively in all works besides the Secret History. And it is the job of a modern historian to poke holes at established narratives like this. Any emperor with a good reputation, they will examine their reigns and question, while bad emperors will get a few brave historians trying to save their reputation. Not only Justinian the Great, but many other beloved Vasileis of old, like Manuel Komnenos the Great, Heraclius, Vasilius the Macedonian, you get the gist. Historians want to be more critical and not be guided by the rose-tinted glasses of dead writers, so they look at if Justinian was really so great. And then they found these things which are commonly parroted in internet critiques of Justinian. Overextension of the empire in the west, so the east became undefendable, overly spending the reserves of Anastasius I for his big dreams, cracking down hard on non-Chalcedonians, harder than most emperors before him, being despotic and going against Roman Republican values and was suppressing the Nika riots. I could go on, but you must have heard many of those before. You could agree, you could disagree. Personally, I would still laud Justinian despite these huge flaws, but I can see why his image is not perfect. And I understand anyone who believes these points can fundamentally undermine his legacy, because he did leave many problems. Why did the Romanians, the Numa type, decide to settle old Dacia instead of joining the Hellenic Romans and reinforcing Thrace, Dalmatia, and Macedonia when it was depopulated and in dire need of defense from the Slavs and later Bulgars? Oh boy. What we now consider as Romanians are the descendants of Eastern Romance speakers in the medieval Balkans, who we now call Vlachs. They are probably also descended from the original Roman settlers brought to Dacia by Trajan, but there are contestations on this point, so I won't say it as fact. My friend, a Romanian, learned in school that the Romanians are descendants of Romanized Dacians from the Danube, and that those people mostly retreated to the mountainous to the mountains in the Balkans after the Romans let go of the province of Dacia, and they developed into many types of Romanians, although the exonym for them is generally just Vlach, which Slavs and Eastern Romans alike called them in the Middle Ages. As with all Balkan topics, there is a lot of controversy and uncertainty surrounding this origin of Romanians, but I think I can still offer you an overview of medieval Romanian history, how they were south of the Danube and coexisted with the Romans of the East, and how they moved north into the area known as Dacia again. So that's the first answer to your question. No, the Romanians didn't migrate to the Dacia in late antiquity, and that was much later, and I'll show you why. I'll follow a linguistic approach to this era of history, since I don't care much for blood and ethnogenesis when it comes to the Balkans. For me, what gives identity to a group of people is their culture, customs, and especially language. So some of you may already know of the retake line, which separates the Latin Balkans from the Hellenic Balkans, and the special Eastern Romance, which developed in the north of this line, could be considered the Proto-Romanian. And we may say those who spoke it were precursors to modern Romanians already. In the 6th century already, there were traces of place names in the militarized Balkan zones of the empire, as recorded by Procopius, to have features of Romanian in the Latin, like how a fort was called Scumbru by Procopius in his age, but used to be named Scumbrus in earlier days. Turning O to U before an M is something Romanian does to Latin. Anyway, let's not get too much into linguistics. I'm just trying to say that evolution of Romanized Dacians into Romanians was a very gradual process that already took place within the early Eastern Roman Empire. Take another instance that contemporary Roman historians wrote, this time from Theophylactus Timocrates, who wrote extensively about the reign of Emperor Mauricius and his Balkan Wars. This then was the time when the Avars and Slavs really began invading the Balkans, and one time, Komnenian was leading some troops to Marcianopolis. On the way, one of the pack animals threw off its load, and one of the soldiers, who was probably a local, called to the animal's owner to turn around and fix this. But instead, this caused chaos to the march, because the soldier didn't think much before calling out in his native language, and he told the owner, Torna, which means turn around. But the military language of the Eastern Roman army was still Latin, as was tradition, so when others heard him, they thought it was a command for retreat, because that was also the imperative of the Latin word for turn. So what was interesting about this incident besides its hilarity? Instead of just commenting that the soldier called out in Latin, Tzimiskes used the term native tongue, meaning whatever his Balkan soldiers spoke had enough of a difference with the common Latin spoken by the Eastern Romans to be considered another language. But from an example of this language, we can see it's clearly at least Latin-based. And these kinds of Eastern Roman history sources are cited all the time by Balkan historians for a national narrative, so I will show you one last fragment that they use a lot, this time from a much later source, the Strategikon of Kikavmenos in the 11th century, during which the use of the term Vlach for Balkan Romance speakers has long been cemented, and Kikavmenos left no doubt about who he spoke about. He talked about how he believed the Vlachs, which he really didn't like, to be of Dacian origin, and he described their habitat to be near where the Serbians lived, while we know in earlier times they were found more in the south, in northern Greece. Later, the Vlachs found themselves in more northern territories. By the late 12th century, when Nikitas Koniatis wrote of how Vlachs, Bulgarians, and Cumans all lived together in Neimos and connived together to form the Second Bulgarian Empire, so there you have it. The Vlachs lived in the mountains of the southern Balkans in the early Middle Ages, but it is speculated that their northward move towards the Danube and Dacia again began after the Bulgar Slayer and the Roman Empire subjugated the Balkans again, due to shift in their pasture lands, since the Vlachs were mostly nomadic and kept sheep. they went towards Dacia only by the later Middle Ages. They did settle in Thrace, Macedonia, and Thessaly, but didn't become part of the Romanized population of the Eastern Roman Empire, due to the lifestyle they adopted. A lot of Vlachs did serve in the Roman army, as has been attested in numerous historical sources, and they did take part in earlier Byzantine attempts to defend the Balkans from Avars and Slavs. But due to the lack of sources for the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries for these Romance speakers, I couldn't tell you why they drifted apart from the main Greek-speaking Romans further south, despite living side by side. I think it's due to a lot of barriers that developed in those times as new conquerors took the Balkans, habits changed. The Latinate, mountain shepherds, and the Hellenic city-dwellers didn't feel exactly too similar anymore. That's the best explanation I can come up with for this complex topic before I lose my mind and start saying the Numa song. At what point did the Sardinians stop considering themselves Roman? Before or after they drifted out of Constantinople's orbit? Sardinia was known to be independently ruled by Eutychius by 1073 at the latest. And look, if we can't even discern clearly when exactly the Romans left Sardinia, it's even harder for us to know when the average Sardinian stopped feeling Roman, because for that we'd need written sources, and they are so scant in medieval Sardinia. We know that the Byzantine heritage has greatly influenced Sardinian culture, and their non-feudal administration, Eastern Christian practices, and survival of Greek as an official language sometime into the Eutychius era, but how Roman would your Sardinian peasant feel? It is known that Sardinia is dependent on Constantinople for high-level stuff, but locals spoke Sardinian, a language closer to Latin and even Italian. So the Latin identity would always have been strong there, but how do we interpret it? In the context of medieval Western Latinitas, or an expression of the Romanitas? There's just too many uncertainties to satisfactorily answer your question. I'm sorry. Did Tzimiskes really have a chance to re-annex the Levant? If so, how do you think history would have gone if he did so successfully? Were the locals thoroughly Muslim majority at that point? Would they have accepted re-entry into the imperial fold? Would Basil II continue pursuing Bulgaria in the future, or would he continue an eastern focus, or would his actions be butterfly effected away? Tzimiskes might have had the chance, but was he interested in doing that? You need to know that this man was very talented and flashy in his military campaigns, but they were designed to impress, to dazzle, to shock and awe enemies, then actually come back every year for real conquest. Tzimiskes couldn't commit to an endeavor for that long, just like he couldn't commit to a relationship with Ilfanu. It's just not his personality. But let's say we infuse a bit of patience and stubbornness which Nikephoros Phokas and Vasilios had, and then I see something of this sort happening. Let's keep in mind that in the 11th century, the Romans and the Fatimids of Egypt were the sole sovereigns of the whole Levant, Romans in the north and Fatimids in the south. The Romans controlled much less Levantine territory directly than their Fatimid neighbors, but through just a few campaigns which Vasilios the Bulgar Slayer, a man who barely spared any attention out of Bulgaria, conducted, the Fatimids realized it was better to share power here, and to let the Romans have some influence in the Muslim-controlled parts of the Holy Land too. If Tzimiskes applied a bit more effort here, Vasilios' job would be much easier. That is to assume that he didn't die prematurely, which in that case, the Bulgarian Komitopoli would not have risen up against Tzimiskes' annexation of the eastern Bulgaria either, when such a feared emperor was on the throne. Without Trajan's Gate, I fail to see how a young Vasilevs would pursue such a grueling lifelong plan to snap the First Bulgarian Empire out of existence. He would have just followed his predecessor Tzimiskes' policies for the most part. Although we have to ask, would Vasilios be half as determined and efficient had he not been traumatized by Samuil? Some history content creators I have heard said that The Bulgar slayer could have either chosen to go after the Bulgarians or the Fatimids during his reign. Those two states were of roughly the same power, and focusing on either would have reduced them to Roman reconquest. But let's be real. Do you really think the Bulgarian rebels, who restored a defeated Tsardom, could match the might of a nascent Islamic empire in Egypt and the Levant, the richest past provinces of the past Roman Empire? Tzimiskes had indeed bragged to the Armenians in a letter that his 975 campaign brought him to the doors of Jerusalem and he was close to taking it, but many historians have demonstrated that it is just hyperbole at this point. I could see the Romans establishing direct control over more cities on the Syrian coast, maybe to as far down as Beirut and the Lebanese ports too, if Tzimiskes showed some more commitment. Maybe in the inland Levant, the Emirate of Aleppo would remain a vassal, and maybe even a tighter ally. But Palestine and everything further down south seems to be too fanciful a dream. Though Christians were still a majority in the Levant until the 12th or 13th century, if my memory serves me correctly. Let me know if any of you are more knowledgeable about this topic. But not all of them were keen on imperial control. The Orthodox Rum and the Melkites are supportive of the government in Constantinople, but the so-called heretics? The Syriacs and Armenians? Some will be happy to receive a Christian hegemon back in this region, but others may still have bad memories of the late antique persecutions conducted by the Chalcedonians. So, it's a complex topic, but that's my honest opinion. History has shown that Romans could maintain a permanent presence in the northernmost Levant by the High Middle Ages, at least Antioch and the surrounding regions. And this beautiful land, being the crossroads of empires, is just very hard for any empire to control in its entirety in such an unstable era. Was the Komnenian Restoration pointless? They could only take back the Anatolian coast, and they were often strong-armed by the Crusaders. No. Next question. The Komnenian Restoration was much more than just a reconquest of Anatolia. It was a socio-political revival of the Roman state on the wider world stage to levels almost unprecedented since antiquity. If you look at a map of the empire under the Komneni, the purple doesn't even look as big as that during the Dark Ages of Rome, since even under the Syrian dynasty, the Romans held a huge landmass of Anatolia. But, dear paradox gamers, coloring a map does not equate prosperity. Keep that in mind. For anyone interested in really understanding the effects of the Komnenian Restoration, I recommend going through Paul Magdaleno's Empire of Manuel Komnenos. It's more of a survey of how well the Roman Empire was doing by Manuel's time, rather than just a narration of Manuel's reign. The empire was richer than ever since the 6th century, held universal prestige even in the eyes of the begrudging Latins, blossomed in art and culture. Well, what else do you want? So it's not pointless. Regarding Anatolia in particular, I once again beseech you to look past pure geographical domination and see the effects of the restoration on the Seljuk interior. So what if a Sultan of Rum still controlled Cappadocia and Pamphylia by the 12th century? This Sultan, whose forefather came on horseback, was now head of a proper court in Iconium. He imitated Roman customs as well as Persian, and looked to the Roman emperor for protection. His subjects were majority Roman. They traded with the empire, retained their Roman language and religion, and influenced the Sultanate so much that by the 13th century, we see amazing signs of Roman-Turkish syncretism in the form of the sultans from Khosrow I onwards. They had high amounts of Greek lineage, knew Greek, regularly interacted with the post-Komnenian Roman rulers, be they Angeli or Lascarids, and some were even Christians. The Sultan Kekawus II even proposed to Michael Palaiologus that he would eat pork to prove his Orthodox faith. The Komneni might not have retaken all of Anatolia by brute force, but those few campaigns they fought on the Anatolian coast proved to the Turks their military might, and their diplomatic approaches to Iconium made damn sure that they had a somewhat reliable vassal in Inner Asia Minor, who gradually became very Romanized even after the collapse of the Komnenian dynasty. So I reiterate, the Komnenian Restoration was in part of hard power, true, but mostly in soft power. The Komneni peaked Roman soft power. They could make their neighbors do practically what they want, while they remained independent. And I see that as an absolute win. Sword and steel isn't everything. That's something politicians today ought to learn too. What would have happened had Halil, the son of Orhan and Theodora Cantacuzene, succeeded to the Ottoman throne as John V hoped? That's one thing I'm wondering about too, and I think my answer might be interesting to you. When Ioannes VI Cantacuzene married his daughter Theodora to Orhan Bey, he was breaking imperial tradition, and the Romans were shocked, despite not being able to go against it. Roman princesses never married Muslim rulers, and Theodora's case was the first of her kind. However, in the east, the Empire of Trebizond also began doing the same under Emperor Alexios III Megas Komnenos, one of the most stable and successful rulers of the Pontian Empire. And one of the reasons Alexios III did so well was his excellent diplomacy with his Turkmen neighbors, and how he integrated them into the Trebizontine society through integrating them into his own family first. Komnenian princesses married Turkic emirs and brought a bit of Romanitas into their lands, showing their husbands the appeals of sticking to a Roman political system, the benefits of cooperation with the Christians rather than war. Those Turkmen sons-in-law of Alexios III caused Trebizond very little trouble and often helped it too, and I suspect this was what the Palaiologi were attempting in the West as well. Theodora acted like the princesses of Trebizond, who protected the Christians under Turkish rule and restored churches in the Beyliks. Her son, if he succeeded to the throne, might just keep this going, to gradually make the Osmanlis and Palaiologi into one big, happy family, gradually Romanize them even more, and deter them from raiding Romania. Halil Bey was already betrothed to marry a Palaiologian princess, and if everything went smoothly, if Halil wasn't murdered by Murad I and came to rule the Ottomans with his Roman bride, the relations between Romans and Turks would improve, to say the least. To what degree, we cannot be certain, but at least the conquest of the Balkans, which historically happened under Sultan Murad, may have been delayed, if not just cancelled. Yes, the Turks crossed over Gallipoli long before, but to permanently settle in Europe, they needed the supporting policies of the Sultan in Bursa. Murad supported it, led campaigns, created a second capital in Adrianople. I don't see Halil doing any of that. And consider that the Ottomans were literally the closest Anatolian Turkish entity to the Roman Empire. If those wandering Turkmens along the Black Sea coast could befriend the Romans of Trebizond, then the Ottomans of Bithynia sure as hell could Romanize even better if the Palaiologi followed the same policy. So in short, nice things may have happened if we got Sultan Halil instead of Murad. What did the Romans do with Derinkuyu and other underground cities in Cappadocia? Did they know of them? Did they live in them? What a funny question. Of course the Romans knew of the underground Cappadocian cities. In fact, they were the most habile users of those tunnels, these underground marvels. Cappadocian structures were usually built by Phrygians, but the later Greco-Roman inhabitants made full use of them, especially starting from the 7th century onwards, when Cappadocia became the frontier of the empire and of Christendom. When Arabs came raiding, Cappadocian Romans took refuge underground. When Turkish sultans started being less tolerant and did their sporadic persecutions of Christians, the Greeks would lay low there, along with the Armenians. Those underground cities of Cappadocia became such testaments of pre-Turkish Cappadocian civilization. They were big in the lives of the people there before 1923, before the Christians of Anatolia were forcibly shoved into Greece. Nowadays, they are Turkish tourist attractions, which is a shame, and this is showed in the very way you asked your question. I froze for a second at Derinkuyu. I have no idea where that is. But then I looked up its name in Cappadocian Greek, Malakopi, and I was like, ah yes, that iconic site. Because Byzantine Malakopia was one of the most important frontier locations during the Arab-Roman Wars, mentioned a few times in the epic of the Ioannes I Tzimiskes, the most famous Byzantine popular poem. So you know that even when the literati of Constantinople cared enough about this rock city in the eastern provinces, it was important in the Roman consciousness. So that's just the edge of the iceberg when it comes to Roman Cappadocia and the material legacy there. Why were imperial subjects in the late Empire so resistant to union with Catholics, even when their fate and very existence were at stake? Alright, this question already addresses the historical facts, and I think I went through the socioeconomic reasons enough in previous videos, so I ask you to think a bit harder on the psychological plane for this phenomenon. Because of 1204, that was plain traumatic. Imagine seeing the Queen of Cities, your home, the capital which never fell, the fortress which withstood Persians and Arabs, the center of your world and of Christendom, utterly raped by those who self-profess as Christians. Would you believe that they were truly your co-religionists then? Those who are lucky, or maybe unlucky enough to survive, will carry this PTSD with them for the rest of their lives. Like, I really don't know how to describe the profound impact to you. In the collective consciousness of the Orthodox Romans, 1204 has become a scar, no matter how well-intentioned some later Catholics were. The survivors will carry this for the rest of their lives, reflect on how God could even allow his greatest city to undergo this torment, come to the conclusion that it was for the sins of the Romans, reinforce Orthodox faith, then teach it to the next generations of Romans. Then it just becomes ingrained, you see. If you are in the Roman cultural sphere, you will never forget a historical trauma that big. And the orthodoxy emphasis was definitely stronger than before 1204. The average Roman would now rather exchange their kingdom on earth for the kingdom of heaven than to be subject to the Latins again. Of course, Roman elites may have different opinions depending on their political shrewdness and interests in the West. But a common Roman might just prefer converting to a completely alien faith, that of the Mohammedans, than to embrace a slightly different version of Christianity. We've seen before how Romans further east, those in the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, also spurned the persecutions of the Imperial Orthodox Church sometimes by just befriending the infidel and becoming a Muslim. It's a very effective middle finger to the central government. Think of heretics like the Palaiologians. It's just something we humans do. We wouldn't mind harming ourselves in the process if it means we get to harm someone else we detest even more. Especially since in comparison to the Latin barbarity in sacking Constantinople and the ruthlessness of the Catalans when Andronicus II hired them to save Anatolia from the Turks, the Ottomans' pillaging seemed almost tame. That, coupled with the lack of pressure to convert to Islam, since the Turks liked it better in those early days of their empire if you stayed Christian and paid them more taxes, when in contrast to the Latins forcing you to acknowledge the Pope, well, that seemed more appealing if a Roman started losing faith in his orthodoxy and questioned if there was some better spiritual alternative. Of course, I reiterate on that part that says the early days of the Ottoman Empire and through the period of Seljuks. The Turkish rulers were comparatively chill as in compared to the later Ottoman Empire and their persecutions of Christians. So I think, yeah, if we just dig a little deeper into our own psyches, ask ourselves, what would I do if someone betrays me, and on the other side, my enemies, but they have some honor on the battlefield and I can face them head on? We can understand seemingly strange actions Romans had during the last days of their empire. psychology as a powerful factor in history. How aware were the Byzantines of the Russian world and its politics in the north? Did they make any effort to somehow leverage them? They were aware. They were literally the ones who gave Russia Christianity. But leveraging the Rus directly, like the Romans did with closer neighbors like the papacy, the Italian states, the Turks, etc., that was only possible in the Macedonian era. When Nicephorus Vlachs had a problem with the Bulgarians, he got the Rus to invade the Bulgarian Empire, although that was not very smart leveraging and Tzimiskes had to beat them off again. But I think you are asking more about the late Byzantine era, and luckily for someone like me, so unaware of the Slavic world of the north, Dmitry Obolensky wrote exactly a very high-quality chapter on this topic in his book Byzantium and the Slavs, so I will be referring mostly to his work. Obolensky described the relationship between the Romans and Russians as an ambiguous blend of attraction and repulsion. Attraction is easy to explain. Byzantine civilization gave birth to that of the Russians. But repulsion, that is the part which interests us. Because the Romans were very aware of what is going on in the Russian world and what they should do to bring benefit to themselves, especially ecclesiastically, as the universal sovereignty of the Ecumenical Church of Constantinople was one of the last major advantages they still had in the 14th century. And with the monopoly over religious legitimacy, the Roman emperor could secure the goodwill and obedience of even such a distant neighbor. The Russians too were aware of this, and they were frustrated that they have to accept appointments of their own metropolitans or other church figures from Constantinople when it suited the Romans to do so. But of course, the Patriarch of Constantinople could back off and grant autonomy to churches in the Russian world for a price, of course. By the Palaiologan era, Romans depended much on Russians economically for trading and financial aid. In fact, they might have been more aware of the Russians' economy than their politics, as the historian Nicephorus Grigoras gave a very comprehensive view of what goods Russia offered. But awareness of each other goes both ways, and the Russians seem to care more about the Romans' politics more than the Romans did the Russians. The Russians knew the Romans needed them, and that's why the ecclesiastical deals from the Roman side could be bargained in the first place. And the Russians knew the Romans were also weak, so that their repulsion sometimes could be manifested, since they knew they were going stronger, and they were in a position to attack those who once gave them their faith. You may remember from my history videos that shortly after the accession of Manuel II Palaiologos, the Grand Prince of Moscow, Vasily I, was known to have omitted the name of the emperor from his commemorations, and he has talked about not submitting to the authority of the emperor, only to the patriarch. The response of Manuel's patriarch, Antonius IV, shows us that sometimes the Romans didn't even need actual ecclesiastical benefits to leverage the Russians, but a simple but strongly worded reminder from His All Holiness was enough to get them to return to recognizing the ecumenical suzerainty of the Vasilavs, seeing how Roman-Russian relations warmed up again during the reign of Manuel, whose son, Ioannes VIII, even married Vasily's daughter. But Ioannes and his unionist policies again offended the Orthodox Russians, who became less and less friendly to the Romans by the 1440s. Although of course they were still sad about the fall of Constantinople, despite all the ecclesiastical drama that happened between them and the past century. So to conclude, they knew each other rather well, although mostly on ecclesiastical and economic terms, and they interacted a lot, although not always with the most altruistic intentions at mind. Did the Byzantines make any headway in the adoption of firearms, and what did they think of them? Well, let's put it this way. When Europe was raging over these new firearms in the late Middle Ages, the Eastern Roman Empire was in its decline phase. They used to be the one putting on the hottest weapons like Greek fire. Now, not anymore. They were falling behind. They must have known about guns in the late 14th century. There was even a possible instance that the Latin-loving Ioannes VII used a gun in another Palaiologan civil war, but it's unclear. I remember that the 1422 siege of Constantinople, the Roman defenders used some guns, but that was barely of any use when confronted with the Turks' huge guns, by which I mean the cannons. Westerners would have sent the Romans some guns as diplomatic gifts sometimes, but that's not nearly enough to equip a whole army. So again, for the 1453 siege of Constantinople, we hear of some sparse use of guns, but only for a few defenders. And it was from this rather biased historian named Ducas, whom historians now have made a habit of doubting everything he says. We also know that Constantinos XI Palaiologos famously had to refuse the services of the cannon maker Orban because of how expensive they were. The Romans never were able to make their own guns. They used them sometimes when their allies gave them. It seemed they didn't even really have an original word for the gun back then, calling it either Moliv de Volant, which means lead thrower, very imaginative, or a Greek form of the Italian and Turkish words for gun, shopeto and tüfek. How do you think Constantine XI died? While there is the famous legend of him declaring the city as Balkans, I am still alive, and racing into the fray, other accounts suggest he was trampled to death, begging his men to kill him, or even attempted to flee. With your knowledge of his character and the situation at the time, what do you think really happened? We are certain of the fact that Constantinos XI died on May 29th, 1453. That much cannot be doubted. He fell with his city, and as much as we'd enjoy believing that he may have secretly survived or was carried off by angels, let's try to be realistic here. Usually, for any questions about Constantinos, I try to look into the source closest to him, the history of his best friend, Julius Francis. Unfortunately, Francis was laconic about the fall of Constantinople, either due to the trauma or because his distant station from the emperor during the last assault made him unaware of many facts. So if we can't rely on Francis, we have to choose to believe one of the other accounts. Knowing Constantinos' character throughout his life, his love for his people and his empire, his courage when dealing with enemies of the state, whether Turks or Latins, I am very hesitant to trust any claim that he was killed while trying to flee. He was the type of leader who led by example and would get neck-deep into combat with his men until the last moment. I think he stood his ground and fought, although how exactly he was finished, I really have no clue. There are multiple legends of soldiers killing the Vlachs. Sometimes it's a Turk, sometimes it's an Arab. 1453 legends constitute a study of its own, I think, and I really can't speculate further past this point. I think Constantinos deserved his post as the last emperor of the Romans and fought with his men until finally they couldn't fight anymore. Probably without such a dramatic quotes or charges, but the ending was no less heroic. Did the Romans then deserve such an emperor? No, but they got him anyway. Did some relevant Romans flee to the Palaiologos of Montferrat, since they shared a dynasty? So, if anyone is confused, the Palaiologos-Montferrat connection came all the way back in the times of Andronicus II, who married Yolanda of Montferrat as his empress. Yolanda, or renamed Irene, was not a weak woman, unlike her husband, and often had many ideas of her own politically, like ruling separately in Thessaloniki for a bit, or thoroughly Latinizing one of their sons, Theodoros Palaiologos, who later just joined his mother's side of the family in Montferrat, becoming the Patriarch of Montferrat and Palaiologi. This line only extinguished in the 16th century, so the Palaiologi were still ruling Montferrat by the time Constantinople fell. But I really can't find any additional resources on this topic. If we consider the Roman refugees' migration pattern, they went mostly to Italian cities that had very strong connections to the empire, like Venice, or those that offered very good futures, like Florence. I would love to answer you, but it's just that no one talked about this topic before. No well-known Renaissance Greeks were located in Montferrat, at least those that I know of, and thus I can't posit if there was a community or not there. It's possible some Romans who settled in Venice or other parts of North Italy later went there, but I doubt Montferrat was a first destination for those refugees, due to its location. Are there any modern-day descendants of the Byzantine imperial or aristocratic families? If you learned anything actually useful from my past two April Fool's videos, you might have seen how easy it was to trace a fake genealogy back to some famous ancient noble, because of how many of us could be connected to more recent royalty, who bred quite frequently, and also they usually had some legendary genealogy to a less likely ancestor. Given that the Komneni onwards, Romans intermarried so often with Western European and later also Muslim dynasties, a lot of aristocrats could claim some sort of descent from Byzantium, although it's usually through the female line, so this kind of connection gets forgotten or lost very soon. The Montferrat Palaiologos line that we just talked about, although extinct now, had marital connections with the Savoyards, and that's a living line, so we may have some real descendants of Andronikos II Palaiologos walking about. Other lineages, like that of the Komneni in the noble Andronikoshvili family of Georgia, or the Cantacuzini in the Cantacuzino family of Romania, are more disputed, but not completely without historical basis. You also periodically get the most ridiculous forged family trees in Europe from time to time. In Greece itself, a lot of people still also have surnames of the great Byzantine houses, like Komnenos or Doukas or Palaiologos. I once saw a martial arts match between a guy named Ioannes Palaiologos and some German, and I was thinking of Emperor Ioannes VIII Palaiologos the whole time, wondering if he exhibited his martial skills to the Westerners during his stay in Florence. But that's a completely unrelated anecdote, just to show you how common such names can be in Greece. But come on, are we to believe every single one of them are descended from Alexis Komnenos? I think not. But some could be, given that the Byzantines had this habit of taking on all the surnames they could find, even those from the female line, as long as they are prestigious. So we must have descendants of Byzantine nobility among us today. It's just hard to figure out who's real and who's fake. Did the libraries of Constantinople still retain ancient works lost to us now? Given that Constantinople was sacked twice, once more seriously by the Crusaders and once more by the Turks, yeah, a lot was indeed lost. The easiest way we could determine that the Romans of Constantinople had more classical texts we do now is the sheer volume of ancient works they cite in their own medieval writings, which none of us have access to in our modern age. A lot of classicists, to their displeasure, now have to dig into the oh-so dry and boring Byzantine texts just to find fragments of information from a lost ancient author. So without commenting on their ingratitude for the medieval Romans and their work in preserving classical knowledge, let us quickly view some examples of what the Byzantines read that we could not today. Petrarch Photius, the brilliant polymath, dedicated a work named the Myrio Vivos to his brother, essentially a reading list for his little bro to get cultured. He listed 279 books, and almost half of them are now lost, including from very famous authors such as Emperor Hadrian or the Neoplatonic philosopher Iamblichus. those are just books from Photos' personal library. Imagine the actual library of Constantinople's collection. There would be even more lost works, and it pains me every time to think about how much wisdom was lost from the Queen of Cities. And that's all the questions I could get to now. Thank you so much for watching, see you in the next Q&A, and stay tuned for future historical content.